Hi, everyone, and happy Invasive Species Awareness Week. My name is Justin Bush, and I'm the Executive Coordinator of the Washington Invasive Species Council. For those of you that aren't aware, the council was established by the state legislature back in 2006, and the council is tasked with providing policy-level direction, planning, and coordination for combating invasive species throughout the state and for preventing the introduction of others that may be harmful. We're really pleased to be bringing you this webinar today, and would really like to thank both Rachel and Washington State University for partnering with us to hold this important webinar. We'll start with some housekeeping. So in the webinar today, you'll be hearing from the subject matter expert as we explore the topic of Washington's first detector program called Washington Pest Watch. So before we kick things off, let's note a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted to our website. If you want to watch it again or you're interested in sharing it with others, it should be available next week. And we do anticipate emailing the link out to you all once it's available via YouTube. The webinar will last approximately 1 hour, and that's including time at the end for question and answers. So if you have questions at any point through the webinar, please enter them into the question box. And at the end, we will facilitate the question and answer period for you. If you have the ability to unmute yourself, please remain muted throughout the webinar as we want to avoid creating feedback. And again, if you're having any problems or if you have any questions, please just enter the information into the chat box. So thank you so much for joining us. We're really glad that you're here. And it's my pleasure to introduce Rachel Bomberger, who's the plant diagnostician with the Washington State University Plant Pest Diagnostic Center in Pullman, Washington. Take it away, Rachel.
All right, thank you, Justin. Welcome all, and as Justin said, happy Invasive Species Week. So invasive species are near and dear to my heart. Whoop, sorry y'all. Because I actually spent the summers in between college during undergrad pulling this thing right here. Yellow star thistle and I go way back, and I have probably more holes in my skin than I would like to admit to due to those gnarly little spines. So invasive species in Washington State and first detector, the Washington Pest Watch, is what we're going to talk about today. So what is an invasive species, right? This is kind of a term that gets thrown around, but it's a little confusing because it means any non-native organism. Well, is wheat native to Washington? You know, one of the largest wheat producing states in the country? No. Are pigs native to Washington? No, they were introduced here intentionally, brought over here to bring about new economic opportunities. So we consider an invasive species something that is non-native and that is causing economic or environmental harm. So it's reducing our ability to grow plants well, either in timber or in agronomic settings, or it's threatening our environment. So that can be our urban forest, our federal forest, etc., just this native area. And then another thing that is important to keep in mind about an invasive species is they're capable of spreading unchecked, right? They have nothing that slows them down. They see something they want to eat and they go for it, and no one's been able to really stop that hunger, that spread that they have. So just keep in mind, this does not include things like livestock, intentionally planted agronomic crops, as I mentioned, like wheat or even pigs, and then non-harmful exotic organisms. With the global industry and the fact that, you know, bugs, insects, and plants don't recognize state or country lines, we have exotic organisms that come into our area, but they do not cause economic or environmental harm. They're kind of neutral. They're here, but they're not causing a disproportionate amount of damage. So keep that in mind as well. This could be any type of living thing. Again, they don't care that they've crossed over into Idaho from Washington or into Canada from the US. But they can be plants, animals, this includes insects, amphibians, larger animals as we'll talk about, as well as diseases, fungi, bacteria, viruses. All of these organisms can move into our area. So why are invasive species an issue? If you're on this webinar, it's more than likely you like being outside. There's a good chance that you like fishing, hiking, or sitting outside your own yard. So the reason we care about invasive species is if you're a fisher, well, this northern pike right here, see those little salmon? Those are little baby salmon. Salmon are a critical part of our economy as well as our waterways environment. So by having this non-native fish come in and start decimating our salmon population, we will see quite literally downstream effects as these salmon are taken out of those ecosystems. Again, my best friend slash enemy, I should say, yellow star thistle over here. I don't know how many of you have had to deal with it, but it's a pretty nasty little plant. It actually kind of smells oddly medicinal, and it's toxic to livestock. So if this gets into a grazing patch or an area where animals might be feeding on it, they can actually get really sick. So this is something we're definitely concerned about because that's changed that grazing environment. And this doesn't just affect recreation and agriculture, it impacts the urban environment. So this is a tree right here that was killed due to insect and disease issues. I don't know how many of you know this statistic, but one tree adds about $1,000 to the property value. So we start losing trees typically at really scary rates of death because of these invasive pathogens and insects. We start reducing the value of people's homes. Further reduction can be seen in neighborhoods. Neighborhoods that have big, beautiful, matured trees tend to actually, again, have higher property value. And there's also a well-noted connection between people's well-being and green space. So the more attractive a green space is, particularly with trees, the better we do physically. Again, if you are a boater, we also have aquatic weeds that can be quite damaging. What these weeds do is they can get tangled in boat motors, and you know, I'm not an engineer, but I'm pretty sure that having a bunch of, I have used my own vacuum, and when I get a bunch of hair wrapped around my vacuum, it stops working the way I want it to. So if you're a boater and you're getting these aquatic weeds tangled in your motor, you're going to see some bad time. The other thing with these aquatic invasive weeds is they can actually increase people's risk of drowning. So that starts to get terrifying because now we have this loss of human life added into. Lastly, we have these quagga mussels in this person's hand right here. Quagga mussels are fantastic at growing. That's another note of invasive species. They tend to be really good at growing. They start to outcompete things or start using space that wasn't previously used. So these quagga mussels will grow on any structure left in the water. I don't know how many of you live in an area that's supplied by hydroelectric water, but these quagga mussels can gunk up that very important machinery. And then lastly, being that we live in the West, fire is a part of our ecosystem, right? Fires come in, they actually help stimulate germination of different pine and different plant species. So it's something that our region has kind of grown up with. We know that this happens. However, when we have invasive species, they start changing the dynamic of that ecosystem. So things like Scotch broom burn hotter, burn faster, and often their flames are higher. So it can be harder for us to control. It can also scorch deeper down into that nice seed bed and then reach further up those growing plants. So it shifts our ecosystem so that it does not know how to bounce back from these fire equations. So how do they get here? Well, there's a lot of different ways. First, we think of the pet trade, if you will. I don't know about you, but I have a vivid memory of being 12 years old and my friend no longer wanting to take care of their African free-toed frog, and instead of giving it to the pound, someone else, I guess frogs probably don't go to the pound, but taking it back so that someone else could care for that organism, and they didn't want to kill it, so they decided to release it into the waterway. That's a terrible idea because some of these things can live and will thrive in these new environments. So all of a sudden we've introduced invasive species. We see this a lot with some different snakes in Florida. The cute little snake starts out about 2 feet. Then all of a sudden it starts growing to 6 feet and it weighs, a pretty hefty amount. That person no longer wants to be responsible for it, so they release it into the wild. And now Florida has an invasive snake problem. Very glad I'm not in Florida because invasive snakes sound very scary. So the council actually works very hard on a Don't Let It Loose program to remind people that if they buy an animal and they no longer want it, they need to surrender it or kill it. Don't just let it loose. Many of us, again, love the outdoors. That tends to be who comes into these types of webinars. I currently have boots on right now, and I bet many of us, if we look down, we will see things like seed and soil clinging to our boots. Because what a plant wants to do is it wants its seed to spread. So it's meant to get embedded into animal fur. Now what happens is as humans, we go hiking around, walking around, and we start to pick up this soil, these seeds, and they hike around with us. So they can get moved into new areas. And if you're on a trip hiking, you could bring an invasive home with you. So decontamination is a huge issue. Another focus that the council has is the Clean Dray Dry effort, which is targeted towards boaters who might be using different waterways. Because just like living organisms don't recognize state lines or country lines, water doesn't either. A lot of our water systems come from other states or other countries. So we can share these waterways, and if we do not make sure that our bilges and our boats are clean of things like quagga mussels or aquatic weeds, we can accidentally introduce them into our waterways, which could then spread down to other states. International shipping, now that we are a primarily global economy, is another way invasive species can come in. This is frequently done in two ways. The egg masses can be attached to the outside of these big metal containers, or the wood packing material, the pallets, can actually have borer larvae inside of them. So we build these pallets, we pack everything up nice and tight, and then as that pallet's moving across the ocean, that larva hatches or turns into an adult. So all of a sudden, we release an adult into that new area. The nursery industry can kind of ding us in two ways. One way can be a lot of our invasive species were planted intentionally. We wanted them here, and then we found out that plant's really good at growing. It's great at escaping. Scotch broom is a wonderful example of this. I still twitch whenever I see Scotch broom in someone's yard. It's a beautiful shrub. It's also very, very good at growing. So we brought it intentionally to try and grow it in our own yards, only to have it escape. And then also the potting media, the soil, and the water used in nurseries for some pathogens can actually spread them around to other areas, as we'll learn about in a bit. And then lastly, we might have more malicious introductions where people want to have a species they like. Maybe they like fishing a certain type of fish, so they want to introduce it into a waterway. What always shocks me about this is I personally don't try and keep fish anywhere near my clothes. So I think this is a little odd that that person wanted to pack some fish with their clothing. So as Justin mentioned, the Washington Invasive Species Council was established in 2006 and has continuously been picked up and is now, will still be around until June 30th, 2022. The vision here is to, Washington relies on its green industry, on its agriculture, its recreation related to outdoors, as well as its timber industry. So we want to protect these areas and keep our economy thriving. And we can do this by reducing the introduction and the spread of these invasive species. So what the council does is they provide planning and coordination to help empower the folks who are actually preventing, detecting, eradicating these species. They have strategic plans that they work on with different states, local agencies, etc. And then it's also where we're going to try and get a lot of education and communication done. You know, how can we build awareness around these invasive species? Because not everyone's as jazzed as probably those of us who are on this call. So the Washington Invasive Species Council is made up of a lot of different folks. We have multiple state departments, including Washington Department of Transportation. This is Ray Willard, he is our chair. We have people like Fish and Wildlife, public utilities, different counties are represented, as well as federal partners. So we have federal Fish and Wildlife, federal Forest Service, Department of Ecology, Department of Agriculture, the Coast Guard, and we also have some private industries involved, as well as Washington State University. So through the Washington Invasive Species Council, they have put together a priority invasive species list. Primarily, we have things like terrestrial plants, as well as insects, as well as aquatic aquatic animals, which includes mussels. And then, again, aquatic plants, we have a lot of waterways in Washington, so we do have more of an emphasis on some of these aquatic animals than other places. Infectious diseases, including white nose syndrome in bat, a particularly devastating fungal disease that is getting spread around. I'm very pro bat, if you can't tell. So to me, this has also been a terrifying disease to watch spread. And lastly, we even have terrestrial animals that are quite significant in their threat to Washington. So we have a strategic plan that covers multiple elements, and what I'm here today to talk about is this blend of education and outreach, as well as early detection and rapid response. How quickly can we find these pests so that we can respond faster? The faster we respond, the higher our success rate and the reduction in impact that pest has. So that brings us to the Washington Pest Watch. I hope all of you have seen these cool stickers and symbols and logos popping about. If you want some, please let Justin or I know, and we will send you some of these great stickers. But so Washington Pest Watch, this is a quote-unquote new network. This has been led by the Washington Invasive Species Council and its partners. And we call it a quote-unquote new network because a lot of different entities, organizations have been doing invasive species outreach and education and training. But by consolidating and working together, we now have a harmonized message that we can share, and then we can also help spread resources. So I'm over in Eastern Washington, aka almost Idaho, so now I can go around and cover some of the east side, whereas a lot of our state government folks were on the west side. So we have some division of duties, and we can cover more trainings and more people by having this network built together. Now, keep in mind with the Washington Pest Watch, the goal is not to actively go out and search for invasive species. We're not asking you to go do surveys in your local park and see if you can find invasive species. We are, however, asking that in your daily life, you know, whether it be if you work in the horticultural industry, the grounds industry, landscaping, or you just particularly enjoy things like hiking and boating, etc., we want you to have in the back of your mind an idea of that area so that you can tell when something's not quite right. And when you see something that's not quite right, you can report it to the Invasive Species Council through our very, very awesome app. So we ask that you attend a training, see an invasive, and report it. We have some great promotional materials. I particularly love this poster right here that shows a biker coming across a feral hog. Bikers whipping out their phone using our WA Invasive app to report this sighting. Now, personal anecdote, I don't recommend if you find a feral hog while you're out hiking, biking, boating. If you're boating and find a hog, that'll be a little odd in its own. But if you find a feral hog, I would like your first instinct to not be to whip out your phone and take a picture. You should probably get away. Feral hogs are pretty nasty animals, and they can be quite aggressive. To the point, the third time I went down to visit my future in-laws, we were going to go on a hike in their property in Texas. And I turn around and see that my father-in-law is putting a pistol in the back of his pants. I have the reaction of, oh no, maybe they don't like me as much as I thought they did. However, I eventually learned, or at least they lied to me and told me, that that pistol was meant for feral hogs that we might come across. Again, this is in Texas, not Washington, but protect yourself first. And then you can call our Squeal on Pigs hotline or use our WA Invasive app. So this is our call to action. This is our rallying cry. If you enjoy Washington outdoors, either as a hiker, hunter, sports fisher, biker, etc., just like taking your family or your loved ones to these natural areas, we want you to be involved because everyone has a role in stopping invasive species. And especially if you like being outside, you are more likely to be the one who comes across that first detection. The first time we see this organism actually tends to be the public. It's not someone like me who's in a lab all day, because I'm in a lab all day, but it's you all who are outside in an area you love quite frequently. you're the ones who are more likely to spot these invasives. And just keep in mind how valuable our natural resources are to Washington State. 34% of Washington is farmland. That's 14.7 million acres. 37% is timberland. That's 16 million acres. And then 54%, again, the math does check out because public land can also include farm and timber and cattle grazing area, is 23 million acres. That is a ton of space dedicated to natural resources. So we have a very vested interest in keeping invasive species out. So our partners, again, can be federal, state, university, Department of Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources. And we work together to create this invasive species effort. So become a first detector, attend trainings like this, as well as our webinars. You can take many of them. You can see our website for a schedule. You can reach out to one of us about getting an in-person training if you would like. I know I travel around and give trainings, particularly to master gardener groups. We also have a great website with educational materials. And again, to highlight this lovely Washington invasive species app, I particularly love it because our priority invasive plant has all of the invasive weeds in Washington State, along with a gorgeous set of photo and information that help you identify. So everyone's affected by invasive species, so we need to work together to solve the problem. We know how to stop invasive species, but to successfully stop an invasion, we need your help. We need you to find it and let us know. That way we can squash that population early. You can find educational resources and trainings at this link right here, invasivespecies.wa.gov. And there, we're here to help you out. Reporting invasive species, if you see it, report it. You can call special hotlines for invasive aquatic species. The number is right here. If you see a feral hog, we have that particular hotline. Again, in that WA Invasives app for both Apple and Android products, as well as our website. These are all ways that you can report invasive species. If you are near your county extension or a conservation district or a diagnostic clinic, you can also just report it to us, and then we will send that information to the council on your behalf. So now let's talk about some invasive species that we're particularly concerned about and have on our radar for Washington State. First is gypsy moth. So gypsy moth is in the order Lepidoptera with family Euribidae, just in case you happen to be an entomologically inclined person. We have two subspecies of these gypsy moths, both Asian and European, which are native to Asia and Europe, respectively. Their habitat is forests. Now take a moment and think, how vague is forest? How many plants, how many trees can be in a forest? Keep this in mind as we go through the gypsy moths. Now, while the moth might be what the organism gets its name from, it's actually the larva that we are particularly concerned about. If you've ever read The Hungry Caterpillar as a child or to your children, remember as that caterpillar is able to eat all the way through. I think he even eats through a woman's shoe at some point. This is actually a true story. Larvae are incredibly destructive. They are so good at eating that they actually tend to be the most problematic life stage of these moths and other moths. So what's the history and distribution? So the European gypsy moth was introduced in the late 1800s into New England because we were trying to establish a silk industry. Now in 1869, they had a hurricane, and those European gypsy moths got out. They escaped, and now they are all over the eastern US. So they've been able to spread over land, particularly when people move from infested states or infested county into a new area. Because these gypsy moths like to lay their eggs in nice, dark, protected areas. So that means things like lawn furniture that have all the undersides. When was the last time you looked at the underside of a lawn chair? It's pretty dirty, right? It's not inconceivable that a moth might try and lay its eggs there to keep them protected. It can also move in firewood. That's why we always talk about don't move firewood or burn it where you buy it, to reduce this chance that maybe it's infested. Timber, train, and cars are also ways that people have moved European gypsy moth around. So Asian gypsy moth has been introduced multiple times, but we've been able to catch it quickly and eradicate it when we find that organism. International shipping is a major pathway because most ports have lots of light, right? They're active 24 hours a day. So that light draws the moth in. The moth then lays its egg on that nice, huge galvanized metal container. And those egg masses can then survive that trip over the ocean into a new country. These egg masses tend to be the most likely thing found. The adults don't live very long, so they won't make the journey. We do get isolated populations of gypsy moth in Washington, but the WSGA is on top of it. They have trapping set up, especially around ports, places where we know that these organisms are likely to enter from. So they're constantly monitoring. That way we can eradicate this pest the second it shows up. So the biology, these are wonderful reproducers. You kind of have to respect their ability to be a good invader. They can lay 100 to 1,000 eggs in a mass July through September. Now again, they're hiding their young, so they're going to protect it. So they're going to choose places near outdoor lighting, as well as cracks, crevices, under boulders, under your lawn furniture, under leaves, or on bark. They're trying to camouflage their egg masses so that nothing else eats them. That means they're very good putting them in inconspicuous places. Now these larvae then hatch, and they do this crazy trick where we call it ballooning. They extend a long silk thread and they wait for wind, and that wind then whips that larva onto the next plant. From there, the larva is able to feed on plant leaves. Now, if you know anything about plants, leaves are kind of important. Probably just as important as roots, because that's the plant's food source. So if we have a larva feeding on plant leaves, we start seeing reduction in that plant's vigor. When a plant reduces its vigor, it can have problems. Now the larva stage is actually one of the longer stages for this organism. It's about 6 to 7 weeks. After that 6 to 7 weeks where that larva is going crazy, it's eating all of those plants, it will then pupate for 10 to 14 days, and then the adults will emerge. The adults only live about 1 to 3 weeks. Their goal is reproduction. They do not feed. So they're concerning because that's what we're going to attract in traps, and they're going to be what's laying eggs that hatch into larvae, but they're not directly doing the damage. For these particular insects, their population outbreaks can last a few years with great amount of damage in that time. So the Asian female moths fly, the European females do not. So this can change the dynamics of the spread. Now the Asian moths have a broader host range than the European, but over 600 species of trees and shrubs can be affected by these organisms. Again, when I talked about the word forest being really ambiguous, well, this is why. Because forests are dynamic. There's a lot of different plants going on. I mean, look at your different levels. You have ground level, shrub level, tree level. Obviously, I used very technical terms right there. But if you think about it, how many of us have an alder or an apple? I have apples in my yard. Poplar, oak, willow, elm, maple, birch, chestnut, hazel, beech, ash, walnut, spruce. I have 5 beautiful mature spruce trees that I would be devastated to lose from this organism. So Asian moths aggressively feed on different, different plants, and then the Europeans specifically on oak, and they are capable of hybridizing. So that means they can mate. So identification, their egg masses are going to be velvety. They tend to be light tan to dark brown. So that's a huge variation in what those eggs can look like. If you think about it, it makes sense because where they're trying to lay those eggs would be where they're going to try and protect it. The larva can be about a finger length. They start out really small when they first hatch, and then they grow. The larvae are fuzzy. I'm going to flip back to this other slide so you can see just this fuzzy dude. I kind of like larvae. I think they're very interesting looking. So a very fuzzy larva, and then the distinctive pattern of these dots is how we would identify the larva. So we have 6 pairs of red dots and then 5 pairs of blue dots. So the adult males tend to be grayish brown to 1/2 inch wingspan. The females are larger, tend to be more white, and then they have these dark markings on their wingspan. So the impact. I don't know why that keeps happening, sorry. They defoliate leaves. They cause huge damage with large populations, right? We need a lot of feeding. I don't know if you can see, there's a lot of ragged margins on this leaf just from that larva feeding. And again, those leaves are how plants gain food. So if we start taking away that tree's ability to grow well, it starts to lose vigor. And all of a sudden it becomes more susceptible to other pests, things like pathogens and insects, which can kill the host. So the larva may or may not kill the plant directly, but its feeding will end up being what causes that plant to lose vigor and become more susceptible. So during these outbreaks, it's 1 to 3 years. That is a long time for a tree to be under that amount of stress. So when we see these trees die or lose their vigor, it will change the compositions of forests. If you have a pine-dominated forest that's been fed upon by these larvae, you'll start to lose your pines. And when that happens, we see other species come in, which could mean invasive species, could mean weedy species. Because one of the IPM methods for controlling weeds is encouraging the vigor and the establishment of your preferred plants. So when we lose these species, we're going to change the composition of our forest. So here's the impact. More than $35 million has been spent every year since 1980 to control the European variety. And a lot of this money is going to be focused on the East Coast, that's where the accidental introduction was. But 25 million so far has been spent to eradicate the Asian variety. This is a lot of money to control this one organism. To drive this message home, one state has lost $72 million in timber production. And think back to our 34% of Washington land is in timber production. How much money do you think we can stand to lose in timber loss? Keep in mind, again, these organisms will lower property values as we see trees decline. And then when we have low vigor trees and they get infested with other organisms, now we also have a safety issue. These trees can fall much easier. And then we have losses in the nursery industry as well. So regulations, custom and border patrols often have different requirements, especially as different vessels are coming in from other countries that have known infestations. So during egg-laying season in Asia and Russia, these boats actually have to be certified before they're allowed to enter into the US. So different counties that have infestations like this map shows here often require inspection of materials, especially outdoor materials, before you're allowed to leave a quarantine area into an uninfested area. So management, again, WSGA sets up tens of thousands of traps yearly to survey for these organisms. And when they find them, they follow up with pesticide applications to eradicate these pests because we do not want them establishing in Washington. Again, $72 million was lost in Pennsylvania's timber industry. I hate to think what would happen to our 34% of green land that is in timber. We do have several pesticide and trap options for home use. If you are interested, please contact one of us. And now, when we talked about vessels from Asia and Russia during egg laying season, these vessels are allowed to self-inspect. So they can look around, go through all of their cargo and see if they find egg masses. Now, you have to respect how wonderfully inventive this is. These egg masses, you think you could flip them off the board, throw them into the ocean, everything would be fine, right? I personally think of Tom Hanks in Castaway every time I think about this floating, bobbing along till it finds land. These egg masses will not die in the ocean. To actually kill these egg masses, they must be burnt, boiled, or placed in alcohol, because if they're thrown overboard, they might float to land and then hatch, which is just amazing that they can withstand those ocean conditions. Inspect outdoor equipment before moving across country. Make sure you're not taking an unanticipated buddy with you as you leave. And because they are moths, they tend to be near light and sheltered areas. All right, next is sudden oak death. This is something near and dear to my heart because I am a trained plant pathologist. This is a plant disease. If any of you speak Greek, you will notice that the genera Phytophthora means plant and destroyer. So scientists weren't messing around when we named this particular pathogen. We knew how devastating it was. So Phytophthora ramorum is just one species in this genus. In Washington, we actually have a lot of native Phytophtheras. I deal with Phytophtheras quite frequently. Our tree fruit industry has a lot of Phytophtheras, but this one Phytophthora, Phytophthora ramorum, is responsible for sudden oak death. So this is actually a water mold. It's not a true fungus. It has a couple of unique features to it that change it from being a fungus to a fungus-like organism. We have at least 31 species or genera that we know can host this pathogen, and then more when it comes to things that haven't actually had the chance to interact. So maybe they can also be infested. This disease causes bark cankers that can girdle and kill a tree, as well as foliar blights. That will reduce the vigor of the shrub, but more importantly, becomes a reservoir for the pathogen, so it may spread. So it was first detected in the mid-1990s. About the same time, actually, it was found in Europe as well as California. So we were trying to point the fingers at these different countries going, you guys gave us this, you gave us this. But in reality, we have no idea how this introduction happened. It was in Marin County of California. So again, we don't know where this organism came from. We don't know what it's doing, where it started out from, where's its native host range. When we're working with invasive species, that's often what we're going to try and do. Where did this come from? What can we use to fight it? But we don't know that, unfortunately. So how this organism spreads, it can actually move its spores in wind-blown rain. So again, California, Oregon, Washington, we have a lot of rain, so this can often move. Movement of infected plants. The nursery industry is particularly hard hit by this particular pathogen, as well as contaminated irrigation and soil water. Now, what makes this a fungus-like organism and not a true fungus is it actually has spores that can swim. We call these zoospores, but they're able to move in that soil water and swim towards a root that they want to infest. They can also be in soil as well as possibly potting mixes. Currently, the distribution is in Europe, forests of California, so the forests of California and Oregon. The second this escaped into the forest tends to be when we get really concerned, because that's when it can spread quickly, fast. It's also found in nurseries, and this happens at different stages. WSGA and ODA and CDFA have done a lot of surveys on checking nurseries in California, Oregon, and Washington, as well as British Columbia. We have the right climate for this pathogen, so we constantly have to be monitoring for this organism. In 2004, when this survey was done and it detected that this pathogen was found in nurseries, they had to do trace forwards, trace back, see where everyone got their plants to figure out where is this infection. Is it in all of these 21 states, or was it from planting materials? So eradication efforts are still continuing 16 years later. So the biology of this organism is it loves our PNW climate. It loves cool and damp. Naturally vulnerable species, as the name implies, are going to be things like tan oak and oak, but also understory plants like camellia and rhododendron, as well as maple, Doug fir, and more. Again, 31 genera. Now, you better believe that with having all these different plants, we can see different symptoms coming about. So it can infest different areas of the plant depending on which type of plant is infested, including the trunk, the branches, the leaves, or the twigs. So tan oak and oaks in particularly can be killed, and they can be killed suddenly. Again, scientists were not very clever. We saw how quickly this disease was killing oaks, so we called it sudden oak death. So this is extremely difficult to distinguish from other plant diseases and disorder. In this corner here, we have a rhododendron. How many of you have seen rhododendron with spots on it? I don't think I've seen a rhododendron without spots on it personally. So these symptoms are really vague, right? We see brown spots. Sometimes we can see shoot blight and necrosis as the plant is dying back. But this can happen for a number of things. There's other pathogens that can be targeting leaves as well as shoots. There could be environmental stresses. So often this does need to come into a diagnostic lab for culturing. And it has to go beyond that. So I can't actually distinguish Phytophthora ramorum from other Phytophtheras, including native Phytophtheras, just under the microscope. We actually have to go down to the molecular level, down to DNA, to figure out, is this Phytophthora ramorum, or is it just one of our natives? So the two major symptoms depending on the host. So here are leaf lesions and shoot dye black. The more upsetting symptom, and really the symptom that we know means the loss of that tree, is cankers. So what a canker is that infested plant area so that it's not conducting movement of water or nutrients from the roots to the top of the plant. So we start to girdle the plant. We start choking off its ability to move water. Now what this does is these trees actually start to bleed. Woo. They actually start to bleed. They produce this red, brown, dark liquid. And if you were to cut, so they are bleeding, and we have these kind of rusty spots underneath. If you were to take a clean knife and cut in, you would see areas that are incredibly dark and discolored and necrotic. And again, that's all from this infestation. And what it does is it starts choking off the tree's ability to make food, to make water, and to move that water and food around. So it does kill the tree incredibly quickly. So we do have quarantines and destruction of potentially infected plants, and this is incredibly costly to a nursery industry. So regulations, there's particular destruction, disposal protocols. Much of coastal California is actually quarantined, and then certain plants and plant products are not allowed to leave. Now, when we talked about the damage that can be done to the nursery industry, I don't know how many of you have gotten to go to a wholesale nursery before, but if a diagnostician does confirm an infested plant, all susceptible plants within 2 meters must be destroyed. In a wholesale nursery setting, this can be hundreds of plants that just have to be destroyed. So immediately, and they're put into a pit and they are burnt. That's how we destroy it. There are no pesticides that we can use for this pathogen. So beyond that 2 meters, all susceptible plants within 10 meters are then put under quarantine for 90 days. Now, if you're in the plant industry, some of our plants, they're really attractive features that we're trying to get homeowners to buy, you know, like fruit or flowers, might not last that 90 days. So all of a sudden, you have plants that are not making it into the market in the right time, where they're consumed quickly or they're purchased quickly because they don't have the traits that the consumer is after. So this could be a huge, huge devastating hit to a nursery industry. So management, in 2004, we said that P. romarum was discovered in nurseries and was shipped across the country. So what we did was what was called a trace forward, trace back. So we started testing and then seeing where those plants, what states those plants went to, and then we had those quarantine and management recommendations come in. And this was a massive effort, from public education, tracking and testing. You know, we use master gardeners, National Plant Diagnostic Network, IPM centers, Forest Service, Department of Agriculture's Cooperative Extension. Everyone was all hands on board to deal with this pest. So prevention strategies, keep in mind, we have no way to control this pest. So we're focused on stopping it from getting into anywhere. So do not distribute infected or suspectedly infected plant material, and have any suspicious symptoms you see tested, right? Best case scenario, as a diagnostician, I get to test something and tell you, hey, it's not Phytophthora minorum. Fantastic news, we can go about our day. Well, let's try and get that plant healthy. Because again, we have no way to actually treat these plants. They are all burnt. They dig a pit, they throw the plants in, and they burn them. So we have no treatment. We really have to focus on prevention. Okay, now we're gonna wrap up with feral swine, everyone's favorite topic. So we have no native swine in the US. All of these swine were actually brought in, they're domesticated pigs, and they were descended from the wild boar. So we have no native sus species in this country at all. So the wild boar is native to Eurasia and North Africa. They prefer habitats with water and a dense vegetative cover. So while they are pretty aggressive and kind of intimidating organisms, they are pretty low down on that food chain, right? There's a lot of predators, so they're going to tend to want to cover themselves. They don't like to be out in the open. Now, I don't know how many of you remember reading Animal Farm, but if you've read that book, you know that pigs are incredibly intelligent. They're highly adaptable. They're omnivores, which means they can eat whatever they want, and they happen to be fantastic breeders, which again great for a domesticated animal that we are trying to grow. Livestock, you can tell I'm a plant person talking about animals. They're great for husbandry, but when they escape, they're very good at surviving. So feral swine were first brought to North America in the 1500s by explorers, and we've had more introductions since then, right? We like these animals, let's bring in new genes, let's create more types of pigs. We've had intentional translocations. So what this means is someone's taken a feral hog population from state A and then moved it into a new state. And they were actually able to go back into the genetics of this organism and see that it actually belonged 3 or 4 states over. And that someone, some human, decided to move these feral hogs. Less aggressive or intentional is escapes from captivity, right? Because we have no native feral hogs, anytime a pig gets out of its pen, it's technically going to be considered feral. So sometimes we have these escapes, and then if they're not caught, they start reproducing, and then within a few generations, they actually become feral. Now, they're currently found in a majority of states. However, in Washington, we have no established population, which is great news. We do see them sometimes. We do see animals that are considered feral, but these populations, if they happen to be an accidental escape, they bring them back to the farmer, or if they are truly feral, we eradicate them. So the biology, feral swines are amazing. They can reproduce at an extremely young age, around 9 months, they start being able to reproduce. They can have 1 to 2 litters a year of 4 to 8 babies. So conceivably, one young female can have 16 babies in a year. That is a huge, huge increase in population. Related female and their young live in what we call sounders. Now, I'm forever ruined with our Seattle Sounders soccer team because this is what I think of anytime I hear Sounders. Adult males are typically solitary, so they are not a part of that sounder. These organisms eat fruit, roots, mushrooms, herbs, as well as smaller animals. So this can be things like lizards, snake, birds, livestock also can be a smaller animal. So now we have more threats to economic well-being. Their preferred habitat is semi-open forest with a nice litter layer and ground vegetation, but they also love marshes and coastal flats, which can be quite problematic. Because these are domesticated animals, they're like dogs in many ways, so we have a wide variation in color and size because we've been domesticating them. They have coarse, bristly hair, can vary in all sorts of different shades of colors, markings, patterns, and the males are typically larger than females, and they may have tusks. And those tusks are pretty scary, to be honest. So identification, if you find a feral hog or you think you might have come across a feral hog, their tracks are identifiable due to their rounded shape, so they're much more round, and they might have visible dew claws that you can see pressed into the earth. It's not going to always work. And if you are so inclined, you can also identify them by their scat. However, keep in mind that their scat will vary because of all of the different types of food that they can eat, right? So as they eat different types of food, that scat might change. I can't identify off of scat, so I have to go through rooting behaviors usually. So rooting behavior, these feral hogs take their trowel-like snout and they push dirt, soil, vegetation around to try and find food that they want to eat. So unless this happens in your raised bed, it's a pretty awful thing. If you are a hiker, these things are things you can easily twist your ankle on, can hurt yourself. If it is in a particularly wet or riparian area, all of a sudden we can drastically change that ecosystem as more soil enters the water. If we have young vulnerable plants, they can also all of a sudden become waterlogged and the plants will likely die. So this creates a major, major disturbance as well as some frustration if you are that homeowner. So what are their impacts? They can destroy and consume crops and fields. They prey on livestock. Again, they can eat small vertebrates. They damage fences as well as irrigation water systems. And if you've ever had to build a fence or lay down irrigation pipe, you know that you don't want to have to do that twice. So these things can be quite a pain in the butt. More terrifying once I followed the WSDA wildlife veterinarian after she gave this talk, but they can spread diseases, things like pseudorabies, brucellosis, tuberculosis, etc., which are transmittable to both people as well as livestock. So now if they get near livestock, they can spread diseases that we've been able to keep out of our food chains. They can also destroy landscaping, parks, and more upsettingly, they can also destroy cemeteries, sacred and archaeological sites. So things that are really important to different cultures and different societies. So these feral hogs have a huge impact. They compete with wildlife because they eat food sources and eat them voraciously. Again, you know, the sounder is multiple female with up to as many as 16 young a year. They can destroy nests, eat eggs, young reptiles, birds, so they can start changing that ecosystem. They also transmit those same diseases to wildlife. Now, we talked that they like marshes and coastal flats. They can start to contaminate these water sources. Their scat increases the nutrients in this water, resulting in toxic algae blooms. They also can spread pathogen parasites, things like E. coli and Giardia, into a waterway, right? And if you like to swim after a hike, this is something that you could encounter. Their wallowing also creates a wonderful mosquito breeding habitat. So again, they're really impacting these ecosystems and natural areas as well as agronomic areas, and they have big impacts on livestock and human health. Further, they destroy vegetation and soil. They also increase turbidity and invasive plants. Remember those boots with those seeds stuck to them? Well, if you look at this guy right here, he looks like he has some soil as well as some seed stuck to him. So that can easily move these invasive plants. So we do regulate these in Washington State federally. Interstate movement of domestic or feral swine is prohibited, again, without proper permits. So if you are a rancher and you're moving domesticated swine, all you have to do is get the permit. What this law is to stop those people who think it's a great idea to move feral swine from state A to state B. We want to stop the feral swine movement. So in Washington, our regulations are any free roaming, not domesticated, domestic escapes, releases, or born feral. These are all considered feral. And the way to think about this is we had a graduate student over here in Pullman who had a pet pig named Gene. If Gene broke off his leash or was outside of his yard, he's considered feral, right? Because he's in a domestic escape. He got out of his enclosure. Now, this doesn't mean that Department of Fish and Wildlife is going to kill Gene. They're going to find Gene and try and take Gene back to his owners, right? That's what's going to happen in that scenario. But we need these regulations to be this tough. That way we can actually get good, effective action. So these feral swine and free roaming swine are prohibited from entering Washington, but again, they don't read state signs and recognize that they should turn around and head back to their other state. They are prohibited, but if they are found, they will be eradicated and disposed of in a humane manner. Again, this doesn't mean that that accidental escape will be shot on site. There's a period where they're going to bring that animal back to its owner. We do consider them deleterious exotic wildlife. So control methods, this is where it gets interesting. A lot of states encourage hunting of feral hogs. If you see a feral hog in Washington, please don't have your first instinct be to go shoot it. Because feral hogs are incredibly smart. So if you shoot and miss that hog will never come back to that site again. So even if you call the Squeal on Pigs hotline or report it through the app, when we send out Department of Fish and Wildlife, they're not actually able to find that hog again. So instead, we ask that you report it. That way we can set up trail cameras, bait piles, do aerial surveys, detection dogs, and eDNA testing. We also can implement trapping and what we call a Judas pig. So that's where we take a pig, put a collar on it, because that pig will go back to its sounder. So then we can find and take care of that entire group, which is really the ideal situation, right? We don't have an established population. We don't want an established population. We do have various outreach efforts, including this Squeal on Pigs. If you would like stickers, please let me know. So reporting invasive species app, our WA invasive app is free, it's easy to use, it's powered by ED or EdMaps is what we like to call it. So it actually helps us improve national maps. that we know where these organisms are. And again, it contains all of the noxious weeds for Washington. So if you see an invasive species, take a picture of your phone, choose which animal you want to report, include a location, write a description, submit the report. It goes to one of us, and we can start actually report validating in response. Justin, do you want to cover this next?
Yeah, great. And fantastic job, Rachel. Thanks so much for doing this. We wanted to share a little bit of information before we took questions about this program. And we first initiated it in 2016. And in 2019, we had over 600 different reports. And I think this really illustrates the value of this program and the great work that the team, including Rachel's, doing. Because historically, before 2015, you could see that we were getting a lot of different reports for Washington State, but primarily they were of invasive plants. And lots of different counties have programs, and there's a great state program through the Department of Agriculture and through the Noxious Weed Control Board. But there wasn't such great messaging on animals, insects, and diseases. And that you can see that since we started this interagency effort in 2016, that not only are we receiving more reports every year, but we're also seeing variation in terms of what's being reported. So in terms of awareness and seeing something and saying something, it seems like we're being effective. And so to illustrate what happens once you make a report, reporting information is really important, and we wanted to share information on what happens once you file a report. So using the invasive species app called Washington Invasives or our website form, it automatically takes a photo, a GPS point, and any information that you include, and it goes into a national database called Early Detection, Distribution, and Mapping System, also known as EDMAPS. That system actually creates an automated notification that goes to the Invasive Species Council. It automatically also goes to state and federal response agencies. And depending on the species and the location, it could also go to local agencies. So it's really pretty neat in that it streamlines the response and really eliminates bottlenecks in terms of getting caught in one person's voicemail box, for example. And so really the name of the game for us is prevention, but where prevention fails, we want to find the very first target species and then immediately respond so that we can stop it and hopefully eliminate it. And we also want you to know that you should report any type of invasive species. And the response varies widely depending on the lead agency or lead agencies, the funding for a program, the specific species, and then also the area of the species that you're reporting. So thinking about noxious weeds, Scotch broom is a great example. In Western Washington, it's pretty well established in most of Western Washington. And if you report it, that data is really valuable because it helps us understand the problem and try to scope a response or try to direct researchers in order to respond in a different way than sending someone out to go pull it, because we just don't have the money or the time. Whereas if you report Scotch broom in Kittitas County, which is over the Cascades, for example, they actually will respond and go pull that plant or treat it. And so it's really hard to explain exactly what will happen, but we wanted to give little case studies before we close out, showing what response could look like. So this is an example of feral swine response, and as of today, we have no known feral swine in Washington, which is really great news. But back in 2015, we had feral swine actually intentionally released on a national forest near Packwood on the Gifford Pinchot National Forest. The report came through the invasive species hotline, and we were able to investigate and actually send a response team out within a week. And when the team was investigating, they were actually able to locate the pigs, and they were males and females of different age classes. And it was in a highly forested area that would have been so forested that you couldn't have flown a helicopter, for example, in order to do eradication. So it was really the worst case scenario for response. But because we received the report from the public, The pigs actually had not started to move too far out into the wild. They were confined mostly along roads or a rock pit where they were released. But you could see that the pigs were actually starting to branch out more into the wilderness, and we could see signs of damage even within a week. And if you look at the map, that green band in this reporting area is the National Forest System. So it really would have been just really the worst case scenario for our state if they would have become established. But we were able to respond, lethally remove them in this case, and then do monitoring to ensure that they were eradicated. And just a great example of response. Go ahead, Rachel. So response doesn't always look the same. And this is another example. This was from 2016, where a really well-meaning group of individuals up in Snohomish County were doing an informal education class for students in the area, and actually photo documented and posted to their Facebook group for their informal group the whole process of taking students, teaching them about goldfish in the wild, and then intentionally releasing them into a salmon-bearing stream, which is really the worst case scenario for us and what we want to avoid. And as Rachel mentioned, we have a great campaign called Don't Let It Loose. And we don't want people to let unwanted pets out because they're not adapted to our environment in a lot of cases, and they might die a slow death in the winter, which is not a good way for a pet to go that you care about. And then secondly, some species that you introduce might actually like our habitat and might start damaging things that we value and invest a lot of time and money into preserving. And so in this case, we were able to work with the Department of Fish and Wildlife Police to issue a warning and prevent this from happening again for those individuals that did it. But most importantly, we were able to take this message, put together a Facebook release about it that eventually was picked up by KXLY. And so this message of prevention is really kind of the response in this case. And we, as an Invasive Species Council, posted the news release on our Facebook, our Instagram, and our Twitter. And so just on our pages alone, we reached over 1,000 people. So we're preventing 1,000 people from making that same mistake. And so that while that's a different type of response than from the feral swine, this report was actually really useful and really prevented a lot of future problems. Go ahead, Rachel. So not every species triggers management action, and in some cases, there's not a state program or a federal program or a local program that exists to deal with an invasive species, but that's not to say that it's not important. And one example is the European chafer, which is a grub that is under grass and turf grass in a lot of cases. And those grubs draw skunks and birds to the area, and they actually destroy turf grass, so people's yards, and really rip it up and damage landscaping, which is a huge problem. But there's not necessarily response funds available for someone to drive out to assist every landowner. In this case, we work with organizations such as Washington State University to develop recommendations and protocols so that landowners are able to manage the issue themselves. And so in this case, when there's a report received of European chafer, the Invasive Species Council notifies Washington State University. They look at the report, and if it's accurate, they provide technical assistance so that the landowner can actually stop the issue and do management themselves in a safe fashion. Go ahead, Rachel. And then finally, this message that Rachel shared of see something, say something is a really good message. And while we have specific invasive species that we know are headed our way in Washington, it's really important to realize that anything that seems out of place, any species that you see in your community or while you're recreating that you've never noticed before, or if you see a large number of species or see signs of damage, take a photo and report it. And just, better safe than sorry. And the most recent example showing the value of this see something, say something message was a report made to the Invasive Species Council in December of 2019. And no one was actually looking for Asian giant hornet, Vespa mandarinia at the time. It wasn't known to be in the United States. It wasn't known to be in Washington. There wasn't trapping occurring. and someone found a dead specimen outside of their hummingbird feeder, snapped a photo, and reported to the Invasive Species Council. And that was a very big deal because it was the first time that a specimen had been found in the United States. It had been intercepted at our ports in the past, but this was the first specimen outside of that scenario. So really big deal. And the Washington State Department of Agriculture, beekeepers from across the state, Washington State University, and the U.S. Department of Agriculture are all working together to address it. It's very much in process at this point. And if you're interested in learning more, we will have a specific webinar posted to our YouTube site early next week about this. So just a great example of see something, say something, and we all have our role to play in stopping invasives. Go ahead, Rachel.
Okay, so just to finish up really quick, I just want to talk about rabbit hemorrhagic diseases is a foreign animal virus disease in the U.S. WSDA is requesting reports of any sick, dead, wild, feral, or domestic European rabbits. We need this data to track the spread for federal reporting. Symptoms can include loss of appetite, lethargy, high fever, spasms, sudden death, actually within 12 to 36 hours of their onset. So it's a very horrific disease for these organisms. And we have had cases diagnosed on orcas, San Juan, Lopez, and Whidbey Islands to date. If you work with European rabbits and you see any evidence of rabbit hemorrhagic disease, please send as much information as you can to veterinarian Susan Kerr with Department of Agriculture for Washington. Include the date reported, whether it's wild, feral, or domestic European rabbit, the signs and symptoms observed, the number dead, the number sick, and your contact information. All right, with that, any questions? And thank you all. Sorry we went a little long, but we had a lot of good information we wanted to get out to you.
Great. Well, first off, we're a little bit over time, and so if you need to leave, feel free. And just know that this webinar is being recorded. It should be available as early as next week on our YouTube account. And we also will be emailing a link to everyone that registered for the webinar. So if you have to go, you can always watch this later. But we do have some questions, Rachel. Let's see. Are there feral swine in the Cascades? And I'll take this, Rachel. There are no known feral swine in the state of Washington today. There have been isolated populations in the past, but to the best of our knowledge, they've been eradicated. We do multiple times a month have issues with escaped domestic pigs, and more often than not, we're able to rehome those very quickly. There are feral swine established in the state of Oregon. There was at one point as many as they believe to be 2,000 in the state of Oregon, but the state and the U.S. Department of Agriculture have been working really hard, and they now believe they have less than 200, which is fantastic news for us. And they're working toward eradication. In Idaho, there are no known established populations, and in British Columbia, there have been recent reports, although there are no known established populations. So we do have the potential to have feral swine naturally moving from at least one neighboring state. And then, as Rachel had pointed out, sometimes people are moving them intentionally. And as we saw with the response case study on the Giver Pinchot National Forest, that does occur. So always remain aware and vigilant of feral swine. So Rachel, the second question is about gypsy moth larvae, and they're asking where they can find photos of gypsy moth larvae, and then how do you identify those?
On the council website, I'm sure we have information on gypsy moth larvae. I can also send you information regarding what these larvae would look like. But again, the most important thing, the larvae are fuzzy. They're actually caterpillars. So they're going to be fuzzy looking, and they will have 6 sets of red dots on their back and then 5 sets of blue. So again, that 6 red dots and 6 pairs of red dot and 5 pairs of blue dot are these really distinctive features for that gypsy moth larva.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So the next question for Pyramorum, when a plant is identified and burned, what is the recommendation for treating the soil where the plants once stood? And is there any way to eradicate the spores from the soil?
So this is actually a really interesting area of research done over at the WSU Puyallup Research and Extension Center. So steam and heat treatment of the soil is a method that we do know will kill P. ramorum spores. So we do have a lot of research going on about that, and it has been steam and heat treatments.
Great.
But again, because this is such a new disease, you will have federal and state partners if it is found. So we don't ask homeowners to go do this themselves or anyone to really be doing this practice by themselves. If you think you have P. ramorum, you need to reach out to myself, WSDA, and we'll help you get the information and start resolving this issue.
And that's a great point. That's another reason to see something and say something in a report an invasive species. Don't always assume that there won't be assistance available from the state or the federal government or the local programs. That if you connect with us, we'll be able to let you know if there's any assistance, any cost share agreements, or treatment assistance that could be provided by crews, for example. Those opportunities do exist. It just depends on the site, the species, and a number of different factors, which it's easier to explain once you file your report.
Just know we're here for you.
So, Rachel, if this person's interested in potentially asking you or someone else to come talk to their Master Gardener chapter, you'd mentioned that you do in-person trainings. How does one initiate that?
You can email me directly. You can also email the WSU Master Gardener Coordinator, Jennifer Marquis, and she can also find me. All you have to do is reach out. Depending on where you are, if you want to reach out to me, I can hook you up with the closest trainer for you, or I'll come out myself if you would like. So just send me an email or contact Justin.
The next question is, do invasive species coincide with noxious weeds? And Rachel, feel free to take it, or I can take it.
Yes, because they can be one and the same. We do have invasive species that are noxious weeds. Things like feral hogs move noxious weeds. So we do see a relationship. And again, when we think back to P. ramorum or gypsy moth, when they start changing the ecosystem because they're killing trees, we will see more weeds move in. Justin, anything you want to add?
No, that's great. And so invasive plants is another way to say noxious weeds. Noxious weeds is a legal term in Washington state. There's a revised code of Washington 1710 are the state noxious weed laws. And it's a legal term for a specific segment of invasive plants that have been classified by the state to be noxious weeds, and they meet such a level of damage to the economy or the environment and are difficult enough to remove that they're actually regulated. And so noxious weeds are invasive plants, but they're not one and the same in some cases. So Rachel, that's those are all the questions we have, but I have a question. It seems like a lot of the plant diseases are actually pretty complex, and I'm wondering if there are any upcoming future trainings focused on like advanced detection and training that are in the pipeline.
Justin, it's great that you mentioned that. We actually have this federal project where we are going to do an advanced training for Master Gardener volunteers. Now, this is an application-based program. It's a limited number of spots that we have available, but we are doing a training to help folks who run Master Gardener plant diagnostic clinics identify plant disease, and in particularly, be on the lookout for invasive plant insects and invasive plant diseases. That way, they know who they can send those samples to. So yes, plant diseases, plant insects can be very confusing. So by having this training, we're going to train more master gardeners so that they can spot these and then help the public out.
Great. So if you're interested in that, Rachel, people should email you.
Yeah, that works fine, and I will direct you to the application, which is only available for Master Gardener volunteers right now. Your county coordinator will have the link for it as well, but I can get you in touch with who you need to get in touch with. And keep in mind, it is actually due March 15th.
Great. Well, Thank you, Rachel, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Happy Invasive Species Awareness Week, and just remember that invasive species are a problem year-round, and we know how to stop invasive species, but we need everyone's help to do it. So always take precautions not to move invasive species, and most importantly, if you see something, say something, and we look forward to working with you on this issue. Thank you all.
Thank you.